Hello, and welcome to the 1455 author series, a virtual portal into the minds of writers that explores their latest work, inspiration, and more. My name is Cliff Garstang, and I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk about my new book, The Last Bird of Paradise. First, a little bit about myself. I live in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia now, but I grew up in the Midwest, went to college in Chicago with ambitions to write fiction. Didn't really do anything about that ambition, however. After college, I joined the Peace Corps, worked in South Korea for a couple of years teaching English, came back, got a master's in English, again, thinking that I was preparing myself to become a writer, but ended up getting a JD, a law degree, and then working for a Chicago law firm because I was really excited about the prospect of having an international career. The Chicago firm sent me overseas. I lived in Singapore for many years, and later I worked in the legal department of the World Bank in Washington, D.C., which also took me to Asia very often. And then eventually I decided that the time was right to focus on writing. So I quit my job, got an MFA, and started in on creative work. I've published several books, including my first collection of short stories, which came out in 2009, another collection or a novel in stories in 2012, a couple of novels and another story collection. And now my latest novel is The Last Bird of Paradise, which is set in Singapore, where, as I said, I lived for a long time. Let me tell you a little bit about that book. It was published in February of this year by Black Rose Writing, a Texas-based press. And it is about two women who moved to Singapore somewhat reluctantly in very different time periods. So in 2002, Aislinn Givens, who is a lawyer in a New York law firm, moves with her husband because he, right after 9/11, is disillusioned with life in New York City and convinces her that they need to get out. He finds a job with an investment bank in Singapore, and they move. Similarly, in 1914, Elizabeth Pennington is a young English woman living in England. World War I is brewing on the continent, and she's involved in something of a scandal at home. So she is basically exiled by her family to Singapore to live with her uncle Cyril, who is a lawyer in Singapore. And these two narratives are connected through some paintings. When Aislinn arrives in Singapore and she's furnishing their apartment, she finds these three paintings by an English woman unknown to her, depicting life in Singapore in the early 19-teens. And she begins to be very interested in this artist, but mostly she's connected to the artist through the paintings themselves, which come alive for her. Aislinn is a very empathetic woman, and she really relates to the stories that are being told in the paintings. One early reviewer described the book as part history, part romance, part corporate intrigue, which I think is spot on because the book is really about unequal power dynamics in all spheres. So in the geopolitical sphere, in the corporate setting, and also in domestic relationships. And we see that through the lives of both of these women. So I'm going to read just a little bit from the two different storylines. Aislinn's storyline is told in the third person, and in the bit that I'm going to read, It's still in New York, and she is trying to decide whether she will, in fact, go with her husband, Liam, to Singapore. And she learns about a art gallery opening in Soho with paintings by a Singaporean artist. So she figures she might as well go see if she can learn something about Singapore before she makes her decision. And in this section, she mentions buttons. She has had a long relationship with painkillers since she had a knee injury playing lacrosse in college. So that's what she's talking about with the buttons. She emerged from a cab in Soho across the street from the gallery. Inside the storefront space, lights blazed over a milling crowd attired in conservative suits and cocktail dresses, and a few in jeans and paint-spattered sweaters, part of the neighborhood's studio scene, she guessed. Curious about this artist from Singapore, she entered the gallery, shed her coat on a rack by the door, and accepted a glass of white wine from a slim young waiter. He was dark, Middle Eastern, she thought, and briefly wondered what nationality he might be, what religion. Did he pose a threat? Was he one of them? Stop, Aislinn commanded herself. What the hell is wrong with you? He's just a boy, a waiter, for God's sake, not a terrorist. Maybe Liam was right. New York right now was driving everyone crazy, and clearly she was no different. She drank her wine, half the glass in one gulp. She knew the risks of drinking with the button in her system, but her mind already swimming dangerously. But at that moment, alcohol was exactly what she craved. She finished the wine, found the waiter, smiled at him, attempting amends for her unspoken insult, and took another glass. She became aware of music and spotted a pale, gaunt woman in a black gown playing a Bach cello suite, a piece Aislinn had always loved, its sonorous strains rippling beneath the gurgle of commingled conversations. She strolled through the throng, not listening to voices, not seeing faces or bodies, all a dizzying blur, only aware of the Bach, the pleasant warmth still building inside her, the bright paintings on the walls, vibrant colors, vaguely tropical images on oversized canvases. Inspired by Gauguin, perhaps, or Rousseau. She stopped moving and looked more closely at the nearest painting. Not nearly so complex as Gauguin, always one of her favorites when she visited the Met, but the colors were vivid, practically throbbing, oranges and yellows, and especially vibrant greens. No naked island women, but the scene was mysterious, inviting a spectral avalanche of flowers, a deep green jungle with soaring palm trees, animal faces. She thought they were tigers or monkeys, but it was hard to be sure with the artist's impressionistic style, and a seductive blue lagoon, its surface as smooth as glass. Come drown yourself in my depths, it seemed to say. As she studied the painting, first one monkey and then another leaped from tree to tree, and a brilliantly colored parrot, red and yellow and blue, flapped noisily from one side of the scene to the other, squawking a shrill warning. A shimmering serpent, something prehistoric and sinewy, rose in the lagoon and sank again, sending ardent ripples across the surface. At the water's edge, a naked savage raised his spear, and then, when an explosion echoed across the lagoon and blood blossomed on his chest, collapsed. Smoke rose from the rifle of a uniformed soldier who had appeared on the opposite shore. She'd thought the work cheerful at first, but it had turned sinister. Was it some kind of animation, video art? It had looked like a normal oil painting, but who knew what technology was available now, especially from a place like Singapore, supposedly the Silicon Valley of Asia, according to Liam. She turned to see if anyone else had seen what she had, this miraculous moving picture, but no, there was no surprise on their faces, no recognition that anything out of the ordinary had occurred. Oblivious, they all sipped their drinks, continued their conversations, wandered through the gallery. So that's a bit of Aislinn, and it's not giving too much away to tell you that she decides to go to Singapore with her husband, mostly to save their marriage, even though she's giving up her legal career. She becomes friends with Shan Li, who is the painter who created those images that Aislinn feels are speaking directly to her. And as I said, she acquires paintings by this artist, Elizabeth Pennington, who was active in 1914 and 15. Let me read a little bit about Elizabeth from her diary. This is how her story is told. We have excerpts from her diary dated in 1914 and 15. And as I said, she feels something of an exile as she sails from London to Singapore. And this is after she's been there a couple of months and is beginning to learn her way around the city. 1 October 1914. Breathless. I'm not sure I will ever again experience the like of it. After Uncle's tour of the settlement the other day, I took it into my head that I should return to some of the most unusual sights to sketch and to reinforce my memory of the colors and the sheer emotions I felt at first glance. The enormity of the Chinese settlement filled me with wonder, not only because of its size. It is a district that spans the ages and races of all mankind, a portal to another world, and will not easily be brought to life on canvas. I knew Uncle would not approve of my plan to return on my own to the temple he showed me, and so I waited until he had departed for the day in his carriage before I approached Lao Po, the older woman who runs our household. I want to go to the Tianhe temple and would like to hire a carriage to take me there, I said to her. She looked at me with the eyes of a blind person, not seeing, not understanding, and without responding, went back to her work, the endless task of sweeping the floors. I repeated myself more insistently, and finally she looked at me, shook her head, and spoke in Chinese words that conveyed their meaning without further explanation. It is forbidden. I understood that Uncle had left instructions to this effect, but I was not to be so easily deterred. Very well, I said. I shall make my way there myself. I had no idea how I would accomplish such a trip, but I gathered my sketch pad and my hat and set off down the bungalow steps toward the road. That bit of bluster had the desired effect, and soon Lao Po was right behind me, muttering, calling out to one of the other servants. Wait, she commanded, and so I stopped, curious as to what solution was to be found to our standoff. Soon a boy appeared. I say boy, but he must have been 16 or 17, a strapping fellow, and I came to understand that he would accompany me and looked after my safety on this most dangerous errand. I was also made to understand that the boy, who was called Ching, was Lao Po's grandson, and so could be trusted. Pleased with the outcome of this negotiation, I set off with my escort. I know not how, but Ching arranged a gharry for us, as Lao Po deemed a rickshaw unsuitable for the likes of me. Off we went, with Ching chattering away about nothing in particular, keen, it seemed, to practice his English, and happy also to be relieved of whatever tedium that might otherwise have occupied him. When we arrived, he helped me down from the carriage and procured from one of the shops a stool where I sat, first in front of the temple and later inside the courtyard, where I was able to properly observe visitors and worshippers. From the very moment I passed through its gate, and despite the unwelcoming stares my presence attracted, the temple's power entered my spirit and fostered within me a sense of peace, of safety. It is nearly impossible to describe in words. On the way home, I did not want to speak, so I took out my sketchbook again, the sight of which silenced Ching, and in gratitude, I quickly drew his handsome, guileless face, presenting it to him when we arrived at the bungalow. His face glowed in wonder, as if he believed he had witnessed a miracle. So that is Elizabeth Pennington, who does her paintings, and she also experiences some of the impact of World War I on Singapore, which is something that I hope readers will find interesting. In some ways, this story has been percolating in me for a very long time. As I mentioned, I lived in Singapore earlier, working for a US law firm, and I got to know the country very well, although not the history so much. But when I lived in Singapore, I bought 3 paintings by a woman artist who was active in Singapore, also in the 19 teens. And whenever I looked at them, I was interested in not only the artist herself, but what was going on in Singapore at the time. And I didn't really learn too much about her, but I did learn about this event called the Singapore Mutiny, which happened in 1915. And so I started to fashion this story about a woman artist in Singapore in 1915. And I wanted to tie that to a contemporary story which dealt with some of the same issues. That is, the consequences of colonial exploitation, and in the case of the 2002 story, neo-colonial exploitation, and also the sources and really causes of terrorism arising from this unequal power that is felt between the East and the West. The first challenge I had was how to tell this story, and I settled on the idea of a diary because I feel that it gives the reader a very intimate look into her. She's revealing some of her secrets, and she's also speaking in a voice that is very distinct, certainly distinct from the voice of Aislinn in the 2002 story. And to write this, I enjoyed doing a great deal of research. I spent 3 weeks a few years ago in Singapore. And even though I knew contemporary Singapore well, I didn't know historical Singapore as well as I needed to. So I was able to visit historical buildings, and I spent several days in the National Library of Singapore researching, looking at newspapers from the era I was interested in, and also a number of volumes in their collection that were relevant to this event, the Singapore Mutiny, and just the era in general. And this was fascinating. I just had a wonderful time doing it, and wish I could have used all of the research that I did in the book. And I would say that research was one of the biggest departures for me in writing this story, as opposed to the other books that I have written, which were all more or less contemporary stories. And of course, writing from the point of view of these 2 women was a departure. I've written short stories from lots of different points of view, but I felt that this story needed to be told by female characters, and it was exciting and challenging and daunting to dive into their minds to try to understand what they were feeling. So that's the new book, and with that, I will turn to some frequently asked questions that I hope you'll be interested in. One question I get often is, do you have a writing routine? Does it vary when you're working on a project? And in theory, my writing routine is that I come to this desk every morning and work on whatever project is at hand, because it seems like I'm always working on a new project. And it might vary depending on what stage of the project I'm in. If I'm creating brand new work, then I may be able to really focus and do that. But often and that might only last for the morning, just because creative energy is draining. But if I'm working on editing a project that's already completed, then I'll probably work afternoons and evenings as well. I also love working in coffee shops, ironically, because there are plenty of distractions, but somehow the noise in the coffee shop helps me to focus. And I also have enjoyed going to writing residencies. I wrote a great deal of this book at the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, which is a wonderful residency space for artists. Do you believe in writer's block? What do you do to avoid the blank page? And basically, I don't believe in writer's block. There are some days when the writing flows better than others, but my basic theory on writer's block is just do it. If I'm not actually composing the story itself, I might write notes or work on an outline or character sketches. With my last book, Oliver's Travels, I was in kind of a rut. I won't say a block, but I had the main characters write me letters to tell me from their perspective what they were feeling and what they were doing and who they were. And none of that made it into the book, of course, but it was very useful for me to understand these characters better. Talk about your creative and personal inspirations. Is there a particular artist you're most influenced by? Well, I do have lots of inspirations. I've been very fortunate to study with some wonderful writers in my MFA program and also at writers' conferences like Breadloaf and Sewanee. And while I may not be influenced by their writing per se, I am influenced by their approach to writing, I think. So some of my teachers were Elizabeth Strout in my MFA program, Tim O'Brien and Grace Paley at writing workshops. And their understanding of the craft of writing and their way of explaining their approaches fascinated me and really inspired me to emulate them. So I can't say that my writing is anything like theirs, but I do take the work very seriously and dedicate myself to the project at hand. Another writer who's been on my mind a lot lately is Colin McCann, whose work I completely love. I remember reading one of his books several years ago and thinking that I couldn't write again because it was so wonderful. And but the cure to that was sitting down and just doing it and doing the best I can. Lately, I've been reading a lot of European literature in translation from people like Annie Ernaux and Jenny Erpenbeck, also Thomas Bernhard, who's Austrian, and Peter Stam, who's Swiss. And because of the work that I'm starting for a new book, those writers, I think, are going to be very influential for that project. How have you developed your literary career? Well, as I said, I wanted to be a writer from an early age and started preparing myself for that in the only way I knew how, because I didn't know who to ask or what to do. I went to get an MA in English because I had never heard of an MFA program at the time. This was a long time ago. And so I didn't really prepare for a writing career so much as I had another career that provided me with material. Working in international law for over 20 years gave me a lot to write about. And I saw a lot traveling around the world and interacting with a lot of different people. So I didn't really start writing until I was taking a career break in the late 90s, and began to write a novel and eventually finished a draft of it. Took some classes at the Writers Center outside of DC in Bethesda, Maryland, and began to learn how to do this thing called writing. And when I finished a draft of that book, I was encouraged, not because it was any good, but because I could complete a novel. And that really gave me the courage to eventually quit my job and get an MFA, because there was a lot that I needed to learn. And I wanted to enter a community of writers. Also, meeting the writers in my MFA program, both the teachers and my peers, was certainly instrumental. So that was how I became a writer, really. Describe the pre and post publication process of this book. How have you engaged with the literary community? Well, the book has just come out as I'm recording this just a few weeks ago. And before publication, there was a lot to deal with, of course. There was about a year between signing the contract and when the book came out, but there were things like the cover, which I absolutely love and had very little to do with. I made a suggestion to the designer at the publisher, and this is what they presented to me, and I loved it from the very beginning. So that was easy from my point of view, and we had some editing back and forth, which took a lot of time. And then there was the prospect of trying to get the word out about the book, both before the publication date and since then. I have had several public events at bookstores and other venues, and I love interacting with readers. And I have to say that I'm very excited about the feedback that I've been getting from people who have read the book, who seem to get what I'm saying. And this includes people I knew in Singapore. So that's also exciting, because they recognize what I'm writing about in this very interesting city, which is one of the most vibrant and beautiful cities in the world. And I'll continue to be doing public events as long as bookstores and venues will have me. How would you define being a literary citizen? How important is community to the creative process? Well, for me, it's very important, because I think that writers need to support each other. Many readers just don't understand what it takes to write a book. And other writers do. So we can commiserate with each other. We can provide feedback to each other. And I have always tried to engage with the literary community in various ways. For many years, I've created an annual literary magazine ranking that I publish on my website for free, which is a tool for helping writers decide where to submit their work. Basically short fiction, essays, and poems, not so much for novels, but it's a way to decide where the best magazines are and where you might like your work to appear. I also do interview series on my website called I've Got Questions. And it's a simple, fairly short interview that I offer to some writers who have new books coming out. I think it's one way that writers can get a little extra exposure. And once the interview appears, they can share it widely. I put it on my social media as well, and it helps get the word out. And whenever I read anything, especially by emerging writers, I do short reviews on Goodreads and Amazon. And I also do a reading log that appears on my website so people can see what I've been reading and how I react to it. But I think these kinds of ratings on Amazon and Goodreads are very helpful to spread the word about projects to other potential readers. What does literary success mean to you? Oh, I don't know. I know it's not about money. I like to have readers. I'm very excited when someone tells me that they've read one of my books, that they have enjoyed it, and that just makes me feel like it's all been worthwhile. I also love being invited to talk to book clubs. Last year, I visited a book club that was reading not one of my newer books, but one of my older books, more than 10 years old. I actually had to reread it before the book club met so that I could respond to their questions. But engaging with readers like that, for me, that's a mark of my success, because people have read it, they've attempted to see what I'm trying to say, and when they engage with my work, I know that I've done the right thing. What advice do you have for other writers? Well, I think it's a cliche, but so there are two things that I typically tell writers just beginning their journey. One is to read widely. It's not about necessarily understanding the market, because who knows what the market is going to be, but it is about understanding how words work, how sentences work, how grammar works, and why it's important on the page. So that's one. Read widely. And the second is, don't give up. I mean, persevere. If writing is important to you, then don't stop. If you stop, you won't finish anything. And if you don't finish anything, you won't publish anything. So don't stop. Keep writing, and best of luck to you. I think I'm done, and I've enjoyed talking to you about my new book, and I would love to hear from you. Thanks very much for listening.